All right. It took me some discipline and willpower to get to the microphone for this because I wasn't like feeling super charged up to talk about, Alberta independence in the context of all of Canada and what's going on in Alberta because it's overwhelming subject to dive into. And I was kind of like, okay, is talking about it going to actually make a difference? Yes, it will, because I think we need multiple perspectives of what's going on, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to understand Alberta independence movement and the non-independence movements, because I don't trust anyone at this point in terms of providing credible information that is objective and based on reason. Because right now I think a lot of what's going on is rooted in wanting to get people's attentions, right? They got to break through the noise just like any other organization. So this episode is going to be about breaking down how I view all of this, and I will caveat a couple things. One, you may have saw my video where I attended a Alberta Independence petition signing at Rundle Park in Edmonton. I went there to see for myself, how many people were there, what was their setup like, what's the culture, what's the vibe of those things. And I drove through. I wasn't even gonna get out of my truck because I was like, I just want to see. But then I kind of saw the long lineup, and I found a parking spot where I could go in through the back and get to the front of the lineup to see their operation. And as soon as I saw the operation and heard the organizers talking about, one, not having enough applications on site, and two, the fact that there was hardly any canvassers there, I wanted to witness and document the disorganization. I didn't go there, and if you watch the video, I didn't comment on whether independence is right or wrong. I went there and commented on the fact that it was actually a poorly run event, and that to me just shows, and two, for Edmonton, a city of Edmonton, there wasn't a lot of people there. Okay, for a city of and surrounding area of over 1 million, a couple thousand or 3,000 is not a lot, right? And you can argue against that whole fact all you want, but you cannot deny that 0.02% or whatever it is, 0.2% of a population is a lot, especially when it comes to a petition and a referendum. And that's what that was. This podcast episode is going to dive a little bit deeper into independence in Canada, because at this point, if you're from BC, Yukon, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, all the way to Nova Scotia, even Newfoundland and Labrador, this debate is going to impact you at some point, especially if Alberta's bargaining chip of independence is really required. Support one another, progress reconciliation, and develop a country that's a little bit more independent and resilient. Okay, so I'm going to start off by going down an adventure rabbit hole. Like this is going through my brain and findings in research over the last many months of following this, because I didn't really get too involved with the whole independence movement and looking into it until, maybe in the summer of 2025. And really the only thing that sparked that for me was I had a little bit more free time from being a business owner. And they were coming out with the UCP, the government of Alberta was coming out with these, announcing these, town hall type discussions about, a sovereign Alberta. And so, once my government initiated that, I wanted to, I needed to do my civic duty and look into it a little bit more, as opposed to just being a bystander. And then as a business owner as well, like, it's in my best interest to understand what's in the heads of Alberta and Albertans. So that sparked me with time. And where I'm going to start is critiquing the Free Alberta strategy, which if you haven't come across it or heard it mentioned, you may have heard little bits and pieces of it, especially what they're calling the final resort. But it's a 2021 document authored by 3 gentlemen, 2 lawyers, and a political scientist from the University of Calgary. I'm not going to go into their backgrounds other than, it's 2 lawyers that specialize in charter and constitutional issues, and a political scientist that worked at the university. So they authored this. And who did they consult with? Who was involved in the consultation and creation of this document? It's not super clear. They have a lot of endorsements from, different members of the Legislative Assembly, former MLAs of Alberta, some other constitutional lawyers. I mean, it's kind of funny because on their website, even the authors of the strategy, have their own endorsement of this strategy on the website, which I thought was kind of funny. And yeah, it's a lot of political endorsement. So who was actually consulted in the process of that? It might be out there, but again, it's nothing that is super in your face. And maybe if I really cared, I would go dig deeper, but I don't care. I just care about the strategy itself as a strategy, right? That's what I'm looking at here. First off the hop, basically, from my observation, this is what the current government of Alberta under Danielle Smith is using as a guide for their, Alberta Sovereignty Act, the town halls that came into play around, should we have a provincial police force? Should we have our own pension plan? What do we do with immigration? Should we have an independent banking system? This Free Alberta strategy seems to be the guide for that, because all of the things that Danielle Smith and her government has done over the last year or two has resulted in, actioning the Free Alberta strategy. Where independence comes in this, because in the strategy, like, independence is not the first option. Right. They talk about all these things about Sovereignty Act, an act that will basically allow Alberta to say to the feds, no, you can't interfere in this because it's a provincial issue. You don't have any constitutional rights. Here's our legislation that's going to dictate our actions and response. Then you get into equalization, termination, tax collection, all the stuff that was involved in those town halls that were held in the summer through the fall, which my comment on those town halls, right, trying to be objective, and there was a lot of feedback from a lot of people on this. The questions and the way that the information was portrayed for those town halls was definitely bias. And I'm not saying that from a place of agreeing or disagreeing with independence or the government. I'm saying that from somebody who has worked for the federal government. I've worked for the government of Alberta. I worked for the government of Alberta for 13 years. And I've worked for the city of Edmonton. Someone who has helped draft legislation and policy, someone who has helped develop strategies and surveys and public engagement events. those questions and the way that the information posed was bias, right? And it followed this narrative that I think didn't do anything to help people be objective. So it kind of just fed into a lot of the information that's out there around why we need a sovereign Alberta, right? Without actually discussing what the hell is sovereign Alberta even mean. And then, so I am critical of that survey. I'm not critical of the town hall process. I think them traveling and doing that is exactly what's needed at the local level. I do have some, critique of how they were emceed and, who was allowed to on the panel to speak and when. It seemed a little bit gate kept that, certain people could only speak when they were invited to speak, when the MC kind of knew that it would add to the case of saying yes to a lot of these questions around provincial police and pension plan and all that. And you can agree or disagree with me on that. It's up to you, obviously. But I agree. The government, and I can tell you, the government of Alberta recognized that bias because halfway through they did update the survey and they did make some changes to their wording. So, just through their own admittance and an update, people's gripes or beefs about the bias, you can't argue with it because they made the changes. Anyway, independence in the strategy is really what they call the final resort. And if you hear, just kind of what I would call everyday Alberta Independence supporters, I'm not talking about Alberta Prosperity Project and their leadership or even their general volunteer base or, whoever's funding them, whatever. You'll hear people in Alberta say that they're signing up for the referendum to vote yes to independence because they want that as a bargaining chip. And that's basically their rationale is the final resort in the strategy is if Ottawa does not respond to the Sovereignty Act and Alberta doing all these things on its own with a police force and giving the province its constitutional rights, then Alberta will use the final resort, hold the referendum, and seek independence. So for me, that's a very slippery slope because there isn't, I don't think there's anything that Ottawa could produce that would make the majority of the independence movement totally happy. I don't know. I don't know what their criteria for success is in negotiations with Ottawa. But I just get the sense that it's going to be less compromise. It's not going to be as win-win as everyone would like it to be. I don't know for sure. But I do question that we're going through this whole process, which is quite traumatizing for a lot of people. It's soaking up a lot of time and money just to have a bargaining chip. Because we already have lots of bargaining chips. And I don't think they've all been fully played or addressed. And again, going through the act of independence, because are we going towards like independence in terms of what the Declaration of Independence says in the US? Are we going to use that as a model and create our own? Like what would our equivalent of Declaration of Independence be for Alberta? That's not even well defined. And I think, defining that after a referendum that, who knows, it could be successful is probably a little bit backwards for me. I would also say that the strategy itself, it's it is very biased because there's a huge statement. It's like half a page in like 45 font that says, if Alberta were considering whether to enter Canada today, it is unlikely in the extreme that Albertans would accept the current terms. Well, you can't say that because we don't even, if Alberta was not in Confederation today at the stage Canada's at after the British North America Act, we don't know what Alberta would be like if we weren't in Confederation today. But maybe we would. Maybe we would be at a point in the province where we haven't gotten hardly any oil out of the oil sands because there was not enough beginning capital, 130 years ago to create that infrastructure. Like, they don't know. So coming out and saying that today, if Alberta were considering whether to enter Canada, it's unlikely because you're looking at it from the position of today. And it's just, I think it's a very misleading and manipulative thing to put in a strategy. It's just not, I don't think it's morally and ethically right. And I think it lacks integrity. So yeah, in the strategy itself, they've got all of these kind of little things like, Alberta can no longer afford to entrust its interests to hostile and unreliable federal governments. And they refer to Ottawa, as, federal, their federal attacks. The Ottawa, the federal government is attacking Alberta. So this kind of militaristic, violent language is being used in the strategy to depict that we are victims from a very hostile, violent oppressor, which I don't see the violence from Ottawa. I don't see them attacking, and I certainly don't see them, being hostile in the sense of how this strategy aims to depict them. So that in itself, for me, I just read the strategy and I'm like, okay, if you're going to go down that road, all you're really doing is sparking, people to be outraged and to have this kind of language. Then I go into, the notes, which is basically just their bibliography or their site. And again, you look at all of the documents and papers and books and people that they use as reference points. It's all very one-sided, right? I couldn't find a site in the 4 or 5 pages that directs to a different perspective or a different take on Alberta's GDP in Canada and what equalization, how that's evolved. Like, it's all very kind of current to the strategy. There's a couple of historical tables in there, but that's mostly around data. So pulling data from, the 80s to present. But in terms of thought leadership, in terms of modern or, in historical context around, politicians from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s in Alberta or even Canada, it's very, very focused in the 2000s. There are some references to the judicial system history, but that's there to back up, their independent judiciary system claims. The Constitution is cited in there, obviously, from the Constitution Act from 1867, other things like that. But again, it's a lot of commentary that is really relatively recent. So for me, leaving out a lot of the historical background to how we got to where we are today leaves out a significant piece of the story that I think many people should be looking into and wondering about. So critiquing the strategy as someone who has written many strategies, it's not a well-authored strategy. Like it says a lot of the right things. It says a lot of the things that people want to hear about, Alberta getting a better deal. It's very economic focused. There's not really a lot of focus on kind of, social aspects of Alberta, the human aspects, the the social capital things that tie us. They do talk about, I do recall, like, I think they talk about like the social cost of sustained federal economic attacks, but I mean, they don't provide any sustenance to that, right? How has Alberta's societal fabric, relationships within, culture within, impacted because of federal attacks, economic attacks, whatever that is, right? So yeah, that's how I look at it. So all I see the strategy in short is, this is the thing that obviously Danielle Smith and the UCP and her cabinet are using as a guide. So, Danielle Smith at the end of the day has bought into independence being a final resort if all else fails, which I think is it failing? I don't know. She came out at her UCP annual event there talking about how she was happy with, the pipeline deal with the feds, but then she got booed. So, how is she going to shift around in that? That's yet to be seen. Okay. Now I want to go over to Forever Canada before I go too into this. And if you haven't heard of Forever Canada, it is a counter independence group in Alberta led by former Deputy Premier and MLA Thomas Lukaszuk, who was a conservative politician, but I don't think he was involved with the UCP side of it as it is today. And, they're even thinner. Like, the only thing on their website is, there's a letter from Mr. Lukaszuk about, Canada not being perfect. We live in turbulent geopolitical times. There's always been regional disagreements. His family's refugees from Poland. And he kind of just makes the case that also because of, Quebec's past history that ended in independence, that ended up into kidnappings and assassinations and more violence, that, we have to counter the Alberta independence movement. And it's really why he decided to put his political capital and all of that into this, because he rejects separatism. So in terms of Forever Canadian movement, there's nothing there. Like, there's just a letter from him, and you can join their mailing list and get a bunch of emails about what they're doing, which recently, as of January 28th, they have announced that they're making their next big strategic or operational or tactical move. I'm not sure. That is to come. They were, I guess, successful in getting 404,000 signatures for their referendum question, which, again, at the end of the day, it's, that's about, I think it's just, it's between 13 to 14% of, those who are eligible to vote in Alberta. We'll see how those numbers compare to the Alberta Independence petition signing, but I don't hold a ton of weight in either of them, because one, on the Alberta Independence side, it's, rotted in talk of people being paid to do this and foreign interference money. And, their overall communication strategy is very manipulative and focused on the economy. And it's very centered on, continually feeding on that disagreement at the Alberta level with Ottawa, especially in the rural agricultural oil industry, which is rightly so because Alberta, was not born on oil. Alberta was born on agriculture. And Ottawa, there are a lot of things that Ottawa has done to make the agriculture industry in Alberta weak. I'll just say weak, or whatever you want to call it. Not profitable as it maybe could be. They're not supporting it as they should be, and that's right from crops to cattle and into other livestock sort of ventures, even down to like the small family ranch where a family might just have 6 or 7 head to have food on the table and to pay for the costs. Like it goes that all the way up to like the ranchers that have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. So Free Alberta Strategy, Alberta Prosperity Project, they're this other group that's out there that is very predominant as the organization. So I would say Free Alberta Strategy is the strategy. Alberta Prosperity Project is the operational arm of this movement. And then you've got these local groups in various regions and communities of Canada or Alberta that are the tactical arm, right? So they're using a very typical kind of management governance style to flow strategy into government through lobbying down to operations and tactics, right? Very, very common thing. And the Alberta Prosperity Project touts itself as an education initiative. I think that's a real stretch, because education implies that it's founded on research, it's founded on a set of principles, integrity, adult learning principles, all of this kind of stuff. So I don't know if I totally agree that it's an education initiative. I think they've just come up with that fancy term to make it come across as less threatening, or, to place them in this kind of like very morally right spot, or whatever. But, my big issue with the Alberta Prosperity Project is, one, the introduction of religion right in their kind of like faith, freedom, family type, kind of motto, or their symbol that they've got. That I have a problem with them injecting a certain religion into everything they do. Okay. It's my first thing. So them as the tactical or the operational arm of the strategy, it's already, for me, lost me at that point. Okay. Then, you go into looking at their education. Well, they discount treaties, for one. They address the treaties in Alberta as basically, First Nations have signed off all their land and ceded and surrendered to Alberta and the Crown. So they don't matter, right? And that is unequivocally incorrect. That is unequivocally wrong. And it ignores, I think it ignores a missed opportunity for them to treat First Nations the way they have in their communications, and I quote, education initiative, because First Nations are great partners. They have a lot of influence at the Ottawa level. And if partnered with correctly, and if reconciliation were to take place a little bit more forthcoming in terms of all of this, I would say that we need to recognize First Nations and those treaties in this conversation, but the Alberta Prosperity Project and Free Alberta Strategy do not. Yes, there was a couple of chiefs or First Nations people on the Alberta town hall panels, but again, you know, I didn't hear them talk a lot about all of the issues. I heard them called upon to talk about a couple of, you know, small areas. So in totality, I don't know. And those town halls by the government should have put on the table, you know, what do you think about treaty amendments, or what do you think about even the fact that the treaties have not even been fulfilled as they were supposed to when they were agreed upon, and even after so many Supreme Court rulings, right? But that was totally ignored, and so that's another thing for me that just shows that this Alberta independence movement is very one-sided to, you know, their position. It doesn't have a lot of diversity, and it doesn't include the treaty conversation. And they're not, I don't think, I'm pretty sure they have not consulted with First Nations. Now you've got the Prosperity Project going out and saying things like fake news. Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation did not block Alberta's separatist petition. I don't know why that would come up, because I from my understanding, I don't think that they did block it. I think they've filed some legal claims challenging the separatist petition. And I don't know if, I think it was reported through Global Edmonton that Sturgeon Cree Nation blocked it, but I think Global would have made a mistake. But anyway, they're kind of it's just going off into this fight, right? Like, we're being attacked as per the Free Alberta Strategy. Ottawa's hostile. We must induce violence and trauma and fight back. That is not the best language. It's, I think, anyway. Okay, so that's where I'm at, right? That's kind of the background. So looking at all of the players involved, including the Forever Canadian movement, and the fact that Alberta independence is the final resort, I don't necessarily, see a lot of separatist people or communications around the fact that independence is just a bargaining chip. I think it's being communicated to the public as, ride or die, independence or die, like life or death here, good or evil, which side are you on? And I don't think it's that black and white. It's not that linear. It's a very complex situation, right? And if we are looking for some sort of leverage on the province or on Ottawa, and Alberta needs this extreme leverage to get what they want from Ottawa, that is not the result of the last 15 or 20 or 25 years, which is mainly what the Free Alberta Strategy cites for information. That goes back all the way to the establishment of colonization and the British Empire, and the financial system within the City of London that has influenced colonial development and influenced Canada as a colony in our current governance system, and has influenced the British North America Act, now the Constitution. Like, there's so much history to how we got here. We can't just pin it on the last 20, 25 years. And I say that coming from an area of expertise, because this is what happens, right? I work in disaster and emergency management. It's the last crisis or disaster that always informs policy or strategy for the next one. And that's wrong thinking, right? If you can't go into 2026 thinking about just the Jasper wildfires from a couple of years ago. You have to include the Fort McMurray fires, the Keno fire in Waterton, the Slave Lake fires, the 2010 Southern Alberta floods, the High River floods, the 1990s floods, the 89 tornado in Edmonton, the ice storms in the 90s in Quebec. You have to go all the Halifax explosion in the early 1900s. Like, you have to go back and look at all of those events to kind of see how things are going to unfold in the future. And that's what I think, and I know there's a lot of people out there that have been in Alberta, like they're probably in their 80s, 70s, 90s, maybe some of them are hitting 100. Good for you. They do look back and they have seen the heartache and the change from, Ottawa's policies from the Depression through to modern times. Some of them it's really hurt. Some of them have done really, really well. There's a lot of very well situated retired farmers in Alberta right now. And, what exactly is their beef other than just, getting on board with this? It's hard to say because everyone's different. I assume that they don't want the next generation, their grandkids and great grandkids and great 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 grandkids, being subject to further hostile attacks, we'll call it, from Ottawa, because I think people from those generations are seeing higher food prices, people literally not being able to own homes, disappearance of jobs. But that's not necessarily Ottawa. That is happening in the US. That is happening in the UK. That is largely a result of North America buying into, including the US, buying into the service economy, right? Labor, manufacturing, hard work, being on the land has not been valued for a very long time. Sitting in a cubicle, providing services over the phone, accounting on a computer, AI, whatever it is, services, that's been valued because that's what's made a lot of money for large accounting firms, banks. Like we are in a service economy right now, and that is not sustainable because we're not producing anything than like bits and bytes and imaginary money and reports and research. Like, I relate this back to my conversation with Katrina Ingram about artificial intelligence in Canada. Canada is a research leader. We are producing documents and thought and creativity through research. That's all going to the States and to China to be commercialized, to produce things, right? The US, software. China, hardware, robots. We have been subject to, that system. That's not just Ottawa's fault. That is the entire financial system and modern day thinking post World War II. Okay. And so I think for, Alberta to blame all of this on Ottawa, it's kind of a manipulation in a way. And I think it's lying by not giving all of the facts, right? I don't hear, at least I have not seen across Alberta Independence movement, social media, communications, things that they're putting out in the public, I don't see them talking a lot about, bigger systemic issues with capitalism, financial markets, insurance industry, politics in general, right? They're just economy. It's not fair. Ottawa. And it's just, I just don't think it's fair to be doing that. And, and again, if you look at the Alberta Prosperity Project, like all of their documents for seniors and for families, it's all information created by them and their spin on the facts and their interpretation of numbers and statistics, right? There isn't, references on their website for, historical books, historical readings, different points of view, because they don't want anyone to see alternative points of view, right? They don't trust the people out there that are also experts in this area but have an alternate view. They don't trust them because they think they're part of the establishment, part of the system, whatever it is. But yet, they don't trust the CBC. They don't trust traditional media outlets. Like, there's the trust on both sides is missing. Okay. And that's a huge problem. It's a big problem, right? I don't think the Forever Canadian group, they don't trust, independence people or separatists. Like, there's just this constant kind of like tribal fight breaking out, which again, it's based on violence. I would say, with Forever Canadian group, even on their website, using their petition as like using the word underdog victory, like that's kind of the same language that's been used for the war, like for Ukraine. Like they're touting their petition of 400,000 as a victory. Well, again, a victory implies violence and war and fight. So both sides are using kind of like this violent military type of language. And that for me is a real problem. Okay, both sides are guilty of it. Forever Canadian movement also, they kind of go into saying like, Alberta will forever be part of Canada. Well, like there's forever nothing, right? There isn't. What even is forever? So I just am disappointed because social media has created this atmosphere where groups like this have to use extreme hooks and language to get people's attention over and above all the other information they're digesting, whether it be TikTok videos of someone and their dog, or watching, their TV show or Stranger Things 5 season. Like all these big entertainment things that take our attention are grassroots organized groups have to cut through all of that using the same hook and bait and marketing ad copy strategies as a large corporation or anyone else trying to cut through the noise. And it's there. I wish that it didn't have to be like that. I wish that we could kind of bring this stuff out without having to induce so much shock and trauma in everything we position. Like, they put things out like, okay, Alberta is landlocked, so it can't trade. They put that as a myth. All right. Alberta already exports billions. Independence won't block trade. Well, no, independence isn't going to block trade, but it's definitely going to have an impact on trade. And there is no way to tell right now if that is positive or negative or a little bit of both. And what will the fluctuation be in trade if Alberta is independent? Because geographically, it is landlocked. There is no pipeline other than down to the US. And, given the state of the US right now, are they a partner that we want to get closer to? Time will tell, because in Alberta being independent is going to take decades. Like, there's still so much work to do. It's just not going to have a referendum, 52% say separate and it happens. There's so much down the road that has to happen. Me being 50, if Alberta voted now to be independent, I don't know if I would be alive to see it actually go through the process to a point where I see any type of impact, good or bad. I just don't think it's going to happen that quickly unless there was some catastrophic event or war or whatever that takes out Ottawa and the UK and the established system that we are running on. But that's like a different story. So where am I at with independence personally? Again, having worked for governments, I don't think we should be running as quickly to independence as we are. I think that there are still other avenues for independence not independence, but sort of closer to Alberta being treated as it should in the Constitution. I think there are still some untried, innovative ideas that are out there, but they've just been silenced for the battering ram, right? Alberta independence is a battering ram. And I don't say that lightly because, again, I don't want to get into all of the war type of stuff. But that's what this is. This is very unhappy province and group of people that are so frustrated that they're just ready to grab a battering ram and go to Ottawa, bust in there and disrupt it internally, right? Where maybe you could argue that in the past, Alberta has tried to use a scalpel and diplomacy and all this other stuff, but I don't think so. I think that the Conservatives who have been running the province since Confederation, other than the very short terms that it's had with the NDP being in power, whether it's like the Social Party of Canada, the Liberals in Alberta, Independent Social Credit, like whatever the kind of ruling government at the time in history, it's, I put a lot of it on the Conservatives because they've been in power for so long. And if they have not been able to find a way by now to get closer to what Alberta needs constitutionally to thrive, and now they're just going for the battering ram, I don't know. I would like to see some evidence of initiatives or I'd like to get ideas of, what other options are out there that haven't been formally recognized or explored outside of what's in this free Alberta strategy. What other groups or think tanks have brought other solutions to the table that are being dismissed because they're not the battering ram, right? Or maybe they haven't gained traction because whoever was trying to get traction on them strategically did a really crummy job. Or maybe it was simply because there was no internet and it was really hard to communicate. And now with social media and the internet age, maybe the group, maybe Free Alberta and the Alberta Prosperity, they just took advantage of, this mass ability to communicate and get people raged out and on board, just like Forever Canadian. I mean, I would also argue too, it's the other side's fault. There's been Western separation talks ever since Alberta entered into Confederation, like since the Great Depression. And, the counter group to that hasn't really organized itself to kind of, bring in another point of view or ideas, right? I think what we've seen is a lot of politicians with influence and business owners with influence that could have brought those counter arguments forward. They haven't really been motivated to, because they were, for lack of better term, fat and happy. They were elected. They were making their money as politicians, getting their influence, sort of towing the conservative line. So why, when you're fat and happy, why would you want to start countering an idea or concept of separatism when it's not in your best interest? So you're not even engaging in that political conversation when you are an MLA or premier, deputy premier, whatever, house leader. You're good. But now, independence the movement has ramped up. So what now is the time for the counter movement, right? It kind of, whether that happens because people have more time or they age and they have more experience and different lived experience and they want to make a stand, or whatever, it threatens something, whatever. It doesn't matter. I think both sides, I think you get my point. So again, personally, I would still like to see other options on the table that is not the Alberta Free Alberta strategy. What's been tried in the past? What hasn't worked? And just because they didn't work in the past doesn't mean they can't work in the future. And was that explored? I don't know. I have no idea. Right? It's really difficult to cut through what's available to figure out what is credible and real and based on fact and true, history in a way that isn't tainted by bias and somebody's motives and things like that. It takes a lot of work, and unfortunately, most people don't have that time. And if it is their full-time job, you kind of again have to go back and research like who's funding them and what organization are they with and who's funding that organization, and are they lobbyists and do they have a specific agenda, right? It's all about those agendas. And I think if you're in Alberta or in Canada and you're kind of on the fence, like you could be for independence, you could be against it. Okay. Obviously you've picked your side and maybe you're not willing to be swayed. But if you're in the middle because you're on the fence, either because you don't have enough information or there's just too much anxiety to go and get that information and make a decision and take action, then what I would recommend is you just disconnect from social media a little bit and go look for yourself at what's going on and read some history books and try and come up and pick a way forward, right? And for me, my wife said something today that was resonated with me a lot. Like, what can we do? Well, we can be witnesses. So I'm definitely a witness to what's going on. I'm observing. I'm talking about what I see and how I perceive it. I am looking at the pros and cons of all sides and all movements. When do I need to pick a side, right? Join the battle, get on the front lines. That is coming up, right? That's coming up. But right now, based on the Free Alberta strategy, based on the government in Alberta of the day, based on the Alberta Prosperity Project, I am not for independence under their strategy, given that the Forever Canadian movement is still very in its early days and it doesn't actually have much sustenance. I'm following them just as much as I am Alberta Prosperity Project, and will follow along and make the decision at the right time. And my actions may not even be to join either. It could be to address what's going on in different avenues, right? It could be, you could walk into, another organization that wants to look at this as a solution, is how do we come up with a win-win, right? I don't know. We'll see. But for now, I shall witness, observe, pass on my perspective. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks for following, like and subscribe, all that good stuff. Episode, please like and subscribe so others like you can find our forum. And if you have a show idea, leave a comment because it could be our next episode.